Good morning, gentlemen. I'm sitting in the Ambassador Hotel in Almaty in Kazakhstan. I'm really enjoying myself, but I thought I should share my enjoyment with you all with this short video. And because I'm in Kazakhstan, I'm intrigued how this country, which was a part of the USSR and earlier the Russian Federation, broke away and has become an independent country. It's very, very surprising, but at the same time, it's a historical necessity to study the breakup of the Russian Empire. All empires do break up, but the breakup of the Russian Empire was precipitated by external factors and one other factor, and that is communism. When you add the external factors and communism, the Russian Empire broke up. And that is the history we are going to study. Russia had a gigantic empire. The Tsars, like the men we remember now, Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, so many of them were there. And the last Tsar was Nicholas II, and they ruled Russia with an iron fist. Well, you may not agree with it, but sometimes an iron fist is required to keep things in place, and they did it. They expanded the Russian Empire into the Asian region, occupied the entire southern Asia, and they ruled over the entire Eastern Europe, including Finland, the Baltic states, Poland. All of these were part of the Russian Empire when the Tsars were ruling. It was a gigantic empire. At that time, the Tsar was always an ally of the French and the British. Well, the reasons are very simple, because this dynasty had blood relations with them. They were all same kin, basically. Well, they had their faults. Everybody has his faults. We got 5 fingers, I got them, but they got different sizes. So there it is. The British at that time were a little scared of the Russians. That is, the Tsarists who were expanding southwards, and they were scared that they would take over Tibet and they would have an opening to the Indian Ocean. That is what the Tsarists really wanted. But finally, the British did prevail. And as we all know, gentlemen, the Russian Revolution put an end to the Tsarist Empire. I think this was one of the biggest blunders the Russian people ever did, or could even think of. I have a lot of respect for Vladimir Putin and Joseph Stalin, but they were die-hard communists, and they had little comprehension of what it means to leave a perpetual dynasty behind. So talking of dynastic politics is a little all bullshit, with the Indians are also doing it all the time, because dynasties are meant to rule the world. That's my view. I'm wrong, right? Agree, disagree, but that's part of the game. Well, gentlemen, the Tsarist family of Nicholas II was imprisoned in Siberia and mercilessly executed on the orders of Lenin and his henchman, that is his 2IC, Leon Trotsky. Trotsky paid a price himself because he was murdered in Mexico by a die-hard supporter of Joseph Stalin. So far, so good, till 1953, till Joseph Stalin died, and the Russians were maintaining the empire of the Tsar. But there was a little difference, whereas the Tsar was autocratic, yes, but he was equal to everybody. And at the same time, his interest was Russia. He was not interested in any global spread of the Russian Empire to, say, America or South America or something like that. But when communism came to Russia, they came with the idealistic dream which doesn't exist and can never be a reality. They talked of international communism, and they set up an organization called the Comintern, which was to spread communism all over the world. So nationalism took a back seat. Now that's a very important point. When the communists came to power in Russia, nationalism took a back seat because they were interested in expanding the empire further to various other countries. Rather than this theory of communism, they wanted to spread to the entire world. And after 1945, when Stalin won the Second World War, the Americans were alarmed and they were thinking of ways and means how they could cut the Soviet state and make it something like an important man in the world. Well, they succeeded. I think in 1954, when Eisenhower was the president and Allen Dulles, I think, was the chief of the CIA, they had made a plan that they would break up the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a monolith organization, but it negated all the human values. It negated everything what Karl Marx had said. Marx had talked of a dictatorship of the proletariat, but here there was no proletariat. It was a dictatorship of the Communist Party, of certain individuals, who ruled and who killed anybody who opposed them, whom they fancied was their opponent. Under the nomenclature which they had developed at that time, enemies of the state. Now, this is a lot of BS, but this is the terminology they were used. There were a lot of revolts against them. In Hungary, there was a revolt, and secretly they had tried Imre Nagy, the Hungarian leader, and executed him. So it was the same thing continuing all over. And once you were doing that, the people were restive. At that time, Russia needed to assimilate all the nationalities into one big cauldron, churn it up together, which they didn't do. They were still talking of dictatorship of the proletariat, and they're talking of spread of communism to the world. They're talking of destruction of capitalism, and they forgot that any economic system in the world cannot function without capitalism. So that is another fatal flaw which the Russians did, and which the Chinese have rectified now. They have market politics, marketing industry in China. They've called in a lot of foreign investments, and we'll discuss that at a later stage in another of my video. But as it stands, the Russians fail to see the writing on the wall, that you have to give basic necessities to all the people, number one. Number two, the Russia at that time was a conglomeration of so many people. There were Muslims of Central Asia, then there were the Serbs, there were so many. The Finns, all of them were part of the Russian Empire or the USSR, but the Russians didn't know how to take them with them. I think development also was concentrated mostly in European Russia, and most of the people or the countries of the Central Asia didn't develop to that level. Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and all these countries which have been conquered by the Tsar's armies didn't get that sort of development which was done in Russia, and the result is there was an economic disparity going all around. That's number one. Number two, they failed to assimilate these people into the Russian Empire or the Russian state. Just talking of socialist republics has got little relevance, when you forget the cardinal principles of running a state and looking forward to. Stalin, to an extent, consolidated Russian rule. Now, I think up to the time Stalin died in 1953, the Russians or the USSR was on the ascendant. Stalin had the distinction of bringing up the Soviet state from an agrarian backward country to the most modern country, and they were able to get their massive long-range bombers, everything going at that time. But the stress, of course, was on military, then on the other economic fields. But they matched up to the Americans, and the Americans then were mighty scared, and that's why the plan of Allen Dulles was that if we have to survive in the world, if America has to maintain its hegemony, we must destroy the Soviet Union. Now, that was the basic tenet of American policy. That is how they set up so many pacts all around Russia at that time, rather rigged Russia with military pacts. We had the Seattle, the CENTO, the Baghdad Pact, NATO. You think of it? They had pacts all over. There's special defense pact with Japan, and the idea was to control Russia. And the Russians walked into the trap of the Americans. And things started off basically when Brezhnev became the chairman of the Central Committee of the Soviet Party. Up to the time of Nikita Khrushchev, things were better. I thought Nikita Khrushchev was one of the best Soviet leaders, much better than even Stalin. He removed the repressive policies of Stalin and made Russia forward. But Nikita Khrushchev was ousted in 1964 in a bloodless coup by the Communist Party, and luckily he was not executed. He was just exiled into a dacha outside Moscow and spent his life there and went away. I think the policies of which Khrushchev has followed saved him. Khrushchev, when he took over after Stalin, ensured that none of the Soviet leaders were executed, unlike what Stalin had done. If you remember, in 1935, there was the famous trial of the comrades of Lenin, when 7 of the prominent communist leaders of that period were executed. And the Western press, if I remember, I've been reading about the period, was clapping and saying that the trials are fair and square. They were never. They were all fixed trials. After that, Stalin went after even the other dissident who had opposed him, that is Trotsky, and got him executed also, rather murdered. And later, the man who had murdered Trotsky was welcomed back into the Soviet fold. After he was released from prison, he had been sentenced to 20 years in jail, and during that period, I don't know whether he had any repentance or no, but he was welcomed back in Russia, given the hero of the Soviet Union and all that bull BS, and that was the end of the story. But probably that was the beginning of the end of the Soviet state. The Russians, as I told you, failed to assimilate the nationalities and make them part of their own country, number one. Number two, they neglected market politics, market economy, industry, production land. And there came a time when the Russians were really hard-pressed. And then some extremely foolish decisions were taken by Brezhnev, like the Afghan war, in which he intervened in a big way. But in 10 years, the Russians didn't have the clout like the Americans had, and they were at the end of the tether when they left Afghanistan in 1989, defeated and licking their wounds. Probably if they had not intervened in Afghanistan, the Soviet state may have survived. But economically, they could not sustain a military campaign of that period over 10 years, unlike the Americans, whose economy runs into trillions of dollars and is many times the size of the Soviet economy at that time. And with the result of the Soviet economy collapsed, and then the hope that America would be off their blood, they began to think of other ways and means. And one of the ways and means they thought is that if we have some form of freedom, things will be better. Now, I think here's the point which I must make. Right from the times of the Tsars to Stalin, Khrushchev, and even up to Brezhnev, Russians have not known what democracy is. So close to 1,000 years, all they have seen is autocracy. That anybody who opposed the state was executed. Now, this is something you cannot deny. And when a man like the Soviet leader Gorbachev came into power, I think he also didn't understand what is democracy. And he wanted to try to bring in openness and perestroika and glasnost and all that. These are things which Russians didn't know these. They only know these words in the Russian language. And these people went and started putting into practice, and that resulted the nationalities which had really not been integrated into the Russian state became restive, and they began to ask for freedom. And another point which we must remember is that wherever the Russians, I don't know it's by nature or what they ruled, they were very harsh on the minorities. That is the point which has to be seen on the non-Russians. Now, Stalin had something very dubious in his approach. I remember reading that he had a talk with Winston Churchill once when they're drinking away till early morning, and Churchill asked him, 2 million people have died in a man-induced famine in Ukraine. What do you think about it? His reply was simple. It's a historical necessity. And I wouldn't mind it even if 10 million have died, Ukrainians, because the danger of revisionism is much more than even facing Nazi Germany. I mean, if you're going to have that sort of a leader, you can well imagine. I think in the induced famine, which is now remembered in 1932-33, when the Ukrainian peasants had resisted the collectivization of agriculture planned by Stalin, they paid a very terrible price. And this was the nationalities were suffering all over. And maybe the Russians were a little better, and because they had the cake and they had the pie also, both. And the Russians began to have a little bit of prosperity, but I don't think there was much of prosperity in places like Kazakhstan. Now, in Kazakhstan, I asked a lot of people how they felt when they were part of the USSR. They said we were happy, yes. But at the same time, when we used to go to Moscow and see the progress there, we didn't have that sort of progress here in Kazakhstan. And we used to long for that sort of progress. And that progress came in the chance in 91, 92, when the Russian state, that the USSR was on its last legs. They didn't have the money. There was restive forces all around, and they had a pacifist leader like Gorbachev, who didn't know a thing about it, anything, and he was just sitting there, and I don't know what was he thinking. Maybe somebody once mentioned he was a CIA agent. I don't agree. He was not a CIA agent. I think he was an idiot. And I think he hastened the breakup of the USSR. And he thought, that was his way of thinking, that if we give some form of freedom to these states, they will still be together with Russia and the states would continue. It didn't happen that way. Because these people, the Russians, had been very harsh on the area they had occupied, even the Polands, the Polish. They had a lot of grouses against the Russians, so had the Finns. Everybody had a grouse against the Russians. With the result that when the forces was unleashed, that is the iron fist which bound Russia was taken away, these countries just rebelled and set up their own administrations. Plebiscites were held, I think, and the majority in all 18 countries, 18 states or nationalities decided to break from this USSR. And it happened like Rip Van Winkle. You know that story of Rip Van Winkle? He went to sleep for 20 years. How did it happen? He'd gone for a hunt, and there he met the druid who gave him a drink. He said, okay, Rip Van drink it, and drank it, and he slept for 20 years, and when woke up, he found he's an old man. And this is precisely what happened to the Russians. Gorbachev was the Rip Van Winkle, he just went to sleep. And the net result was the Soviet state broke up into 18 states. And none of these states now, whether you take it as Azerbaijan or you take Finland, which was earlier part of the Tsar Empire, or the Baltic states or Poland, are enamored of the Russians. Ukraine particularly wants nothing to do. And most of these countries, other than Ukraine, have joined NATO. That's why he sees better, because these were part of the Russian sphere of influence at that time, the Soviet influence. Russia had the Warsaw Pact, but all that's gone. It's on paper now. You just read it, that there was such a pact. And NATO is now ruling. The Americans are the ones who are calling the shots. They're the global power, the unipolar power. Perhaps now they are realizing that the only power they have to face and they have to defeat is China. But I'll talk that. This lengthy video is going to be my discussion on that aspect. Well, gentlemen, the facts are clear. The Soviet leadership didn't see the future, the look at the future. They didn't think about following Marx in its pristine effect. They modified it to Marxism, Leninism, and forgot about dictatorship of the proletariat, this thing, that thing, made it a dictatorship of the party. So it was anything but what Marx had said. And the seeds were sown because they didn't concentrate on Russia enough, or the USSR, and holding it together. They were a little too ambitious. They thought to spread communism all over the world. It's not too easy. And with the Americans and the others ganged up against the Russians. And the inevitable happened. The Russian Empire broke up. And I'm watching that Kazakhstan now is a very, very developed country. It's got an income which is, I think, 12 times the size of India, the per capita income. And yesterday I had been traveling all over Kazakhstan, and I find nothing but development. And I think all credit to the breakup of the Soviet Union. People are happy now that they are developing, and their income is high. There are wonderful things to eat. It's a cold country, yes, and yet not on the tourist map of the world. But gentlemen, this is the fruit of being free from Soviet rule and what we call now Russian rule. The Russians have to do introspection. Look in the mirror. You know, the only way you can see how you look and how what you've done is in the mirror. The mirror is the only one will tell you, well, this is what you are. As over time, the Russians looked into the mirror and saw what they are. And it's a tragedy that the empire which the Tsar had built up over centuries should have just collapsed within 2 years. It's something very, very interesting, exciting, and this collapse rivals the collapse of the British Empire just after the end of World War II in 1945. Well, gentlemen, these are just my thoughts, and I think any of these die-hard communist leftists think they are great people. Just give them a long rope, tell them, okay, friend, keep hopping, don't come here, because they are the ones which break up a country. And the Indian communists are also capable of doing that. Well, gentlemen, I will say goodbye now. And coming to my request, it is that you please subscribe to my channel, share to your friends, and I hope you comment also and tell other friends to follow up. I need the support of all you chaps. I'm not one of the big chaps, you know. I don't ask for any money, you know, like most of the channels are saying. They put up a WhatsApp image and say, please contribute. I don't want anything. I just want your love and affection. Just watch my videos. And if you disagree, wonderful. I love it. And if you like my videos, I love it more. Okay, gentlemen, goodbye and God bless. Take care. Till we meet again.